All right. Okay, let's get doing some Maya. Okay, so today I'm going to run through how I use Maya as a designer. And unlike how a lot of modelers use Maya, I think the distinction is here that we're not trying to make production-ready models in this tutorial. What we're doing is using Maya and exploring it as a 3D tool to help us as designers design anything from props to locations to characters. Specifically today, what I'm going to do is look at environments or building designs. And I'm going to just run through the basics of Maya to get a new user oriented in terms of the interface, the tools that you need to concern yourself with, and an approach to using both 3D and 2D tools to help analyze, look at reference, build reference, and then take that reference and transform it into something that's a little bit more stylized or cartoony, as I like to say. So I've got up on the screen right now a model that I put together in Maya, and it is based on a building that I took a photo of here in my hometown of Vancouver. So we're going to try and build this building, but we're not going to try and build this building verbatim. What we're going to do is create what we call a proxy, which is just simply a low poly or low resolution model that we can then use and kit bash and make other designs. But the first approach that I usually do is just build what I see. And like I said, we're not going to build it verbatim, but what we want to capture is the basic shape and the basic components that make this building up so that we have all the right assets, so to speak, that we can then create new designs based on this building's architecture. Think of it like a Lego kit. In a Lego kit, you have a bunch of different parts and pieces, and those parts and pieces can be duplicated and added on to one another to create bigger and larger things. So if you look at this building here, we've really got a few simple design elements that are constantly repeated from floor to floor to give us this whole building design. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we're going to just start off. I'm going to bring up another version of Maya here. And we're going to go through the interface and some of the basic primitive shapes that you can pull from Maya to help build your designs. So I'm actually working with a specialized shelf here. The shelves are all these little tabs up here. And Maya comes with a bunch of different shelves for NURBS and for polygonal modeling, for sculpting, rigging, etc. I've got a special one here made by one of our instructors. It's called our ACA modeling shelf. And these are just some really basic tools that designers would be interested in. And I'm not even going to go through all of them in this tutorial. I'm just going to look at Get Primitive Cube for now, just to get us oriented. So I'm just going to click on this little cube-like box. So any of these primitive shapes I can click on, and it generates a basic shape for me, which I can then use as a building block to build more complex shapes. So the first thing we want to see, or sorry, the first thing we want to talk about is how Maya manages all these objects and some of the basics that you need to think about, not only in Maya, in basically any 3D program. So unlike a 2D program, a 3D program has three axes. You have X, Y, and Z, and they're represented by these three different colors here. Let me use translation. So here you've got the green one is our Y translation. Our X one is our red one is our X translation, and our blue one is our Z. And right now I've just shortcut key W has given me these arrows, and what I can do is I can move these objects along our three-dimensional space inside of the Maya interface. This is what's called a perspective window, is what I have right here. And if I click on the Alt button if I'm on a PC, and I just rotate around by holding the left mouse button and keeping it clicked down and just moving the mouse button around, I can orbit around this object. So in terms of navigation, this is super helpful, right? Because you can look at your object from all different sides, which is great as a designer. When you're designing two-dimensionally on paper or digitally, you're only seeing two dimensions at any given time, Y and X usually. With 3D, you've got that added benefit of Z. You get depth, and that's going to allow you to visualize more complex shapes. So all objects, this one included, have a center point or pivot point. Now, by default in our ACA modeling shelf, our center point is actually located on the bottom of this cube. Just as an example, I'm going to go to the default Maya modeling shelf and grab the same thing, grab a cube. But what you'll notice, this cube here, you'll notice that it sits both above and below this grid plane here. And this grid plane is our zero grid plane. It's basically the ground of our world. And by default, a cube will come up and half of it is underground and half of it is above ground. And it's great for your modeling stuff because that center point is going to scale that object from the very middle of that object. You can see here I've got my scaling tool being used, and to get my scaling tool, it's just simply R on the keyboard. And you'll see on the side here what's called a channel box. You've got translation, rotation, and scaling. Those are the basic transforms that you would put on any kind of object to either move it in space or to change its size and its shape. I'm just going to delete that by hitting delete. I'm going to go back to our ACA modeling shelf. I'm going to grab a cube again. And you'll see that this cube, its center point, or its pivot point, as it's also known as, is on the bottom of the cube. And the reason why we've done that specifically is if you're modeling buildings on a streetscape, whatnot, you're always going to be scaling up in Y. So if you want a shorter building, you pull it down in Y. If you want a taller building, you can scale it up in Y. And all I'm doing is I'm grabbing the Y handle, the yellow one there, and I am holding down my left mouse button and I'm dragging the mouse around. So just move it back and forth and you'll see that that object gets to scale in that direction. Similarly, I can do the same for Z. Grab the Z handle, slide my mouse back and forth by clicking on the left mouse button, keeping it depressed, and it's going to increase the volume or the Z axis of that object. Same with X, right? So we can scale things, so get them from a perfect cube to a different kind of shape. Beyond scaling objects as a whole, you can also affect just elements of the object. So by having the object selected, and by selecting it, all I'm doing is left mouse, right? I can click and drag, or I can just simply click on an object and it'll be highlighted in green. I know that object is now active and I can do things to it. If I have it selected and I right click and hold down my right mouse button, you'll see that I've got a whole bunch of other menu items. Maya is really good at being confusing, and there are a zillion different ways to bring different tools up, but a really good quick menu here for doing some really basic object manipulation is just by right-clicking a mouse button and holding the right mouse button down while an object is selected. And I've got things such as edge, vertex, vertex face, face, multi-UV, and object mode. And for the most part, I'm going to go, most of the time, I'm going to work in object mode. The other two I'm going to be concerned with for now, actually three, would be vertex. Vertexes are all these little red dots that make up this object. And I can select those dots, either one or a group of them, and I can change them. And by changing them, I can transform them. So I'm going to hit R on my, sorry, I'm going to hit W on my keyboard to bring up translation, right? And I am just going to grab the X handle and I'm going to move that around. So you can see that that object now has changed its shape, okay? Just going to Control Z to undo. Now I can grab multiple points at a time. If I hold Shift down, now I've got 2 points. And notice the pivot point is in the middle of those two objects. If I also grab 2 more points, the pivot point would be in the middle of the 4 objects, etc. Right? Let's just try scaling those. So by hitting R on the keyboard and hitting the middle cube there, the yellow cube, I'm going to uniformly scale these objects. And they're going to scale away from that center point. Okay? This is a really good way to manipulate an object. Control Z there. So we can move these things, these little red dots, and they are called vertices, right? And if I have some selected and I want to deselect them, the easiest way to do is just click on some empty space with your left mouse button, and it'll deselect. The other way you can do it is you can move an edge. So edges are these edge lines on the object themselves. So I can pick one edge at a time. I'm going to hit W, gives me to translate, and I'm going to move that handle, and I can move that edge wherever I need. All right, and again, I can pick multiple edges and move 2 edges at a time. Right, I can also rotate edges, so let's try that. I'm going to hit E, and now I can rotate those edges. And again, the rotation is going to pivot about the center point of the edges that I've chosen. Another way I can manipulate objects is by grabbing their face. Now, just in case you missed it, what I'm doing is as the object is selected and active, I am right-clicking, holding the right mouse button down, and it's going to point to face. This is another one of tools that are super handy. So similarly to vertices and edges, I can grab a face and move that object. I can grab a face and I can rotate it. I can also grab a face and scale it. Okay, so scale, rotation, and translation are probably the most popular tools that you're going to use as a designer when you're working with basic 3D objects to manipulate them to give the shape and form that you're looking for. So I'm just going to review some of that, just so you know. I'm going to go through it really quickly. So I've got this primitive object, cube. Let's get a new one. Grabbed it from my shelf, right? It's got a pivot point there. It's highlighted in green, red, and blue, right? And I've got three basic transforms, or as 3D artists like to call them, SRT. S standing for scaling, R for rotation, and T for translation. So if you ever hear a 3D person go, yes, what are the SRTs? They're talking about your scaling, your rotation, and your translation. So I can manipulate this object. So to get SRTs in terms of tool set, you want to concern yourself with the W, the E, and the R button on your keyboard. W, when you hit it, brings up the arrow ones. That's for translation. So I can move this object, right? E will bring up rotation. I can rotate this object. And by grabbing these handles, I'm going to rotate in a specific axis. And by hitting R, I'm going to be able to scale this object. And I can scale uniformly by grabbing the yellow or the middle cube there inside of that icon. Or I can grab any of the one handles, X, Y, and Z, to scale that object in different directions. Now, in terms of my viewport, you've probably noticed that I'm doing a bunch of things and I'm moving the camera around. In terms of my viewport, I can hold down Alt, left mouse button, hold that down, rotate around, okay? I can also use my scroll wheel. If I have a middle mouse button here, with the scroll wheel, I can scroll. That allows me, and I'm just scrolling the scroll wheel on my middle mouse button. That allows me to zoom in and out. It's not changing the lens of the camera, it's just physically moving the camera further away from the object or getting me closer to the object. I can also hold down Alt and I can also hold down Alt and push my middle mouse button to scroll along this scene. So rather than rotate, which is the left mouse button, the middle mouse button will allow me to go dolly from left to right. All right. And I think the right mouse button allows me, as I hold it down, to dolly in and dolly out of my scene. All right, so some navigation tips there. The other thing you might want to know about is as you scale objects up, they might be really big. A really quick way to see that object is to hit F on the keyboard, and that will frame the selection. So that will pull the camera back so you can see that whole object there. Okay, so there's some basic navigations of the Maya interface and some basic tool sets. Get primitive cube, and then I've got my scaling and rotation and translation, and I can manipulate the whole object, or I can right click and manipulate a vertex, these red dots, right? I can move them around. I can also right click and select edges, and I can hold shift and select multiple edges, and I can scale those edges. I can move those edges, and I can rotate those edges. And then last but not least, I can also grab a face on an object, and I can manipulate these faces. So I'm going to grab these two faces and scale them out. Now that's going to scale the whole object because I'll grab the whole face and they're all connected together. Or I can just scale. Oops, I think I have multiple faces selected there. Let's just select one face. There we go. Okay, pretty basic stuff. Let's actually make something. Let's look at this building. I've got this building in Photoshop. And one of the first things you want to do before you attack building this thing is just take some time to look at your reference and kind of break it down and analyze it. Now we can take out a measuring tape and we can measure stuff and we can model to scale. That's totally possible to do. But honestly, I find that a bit time consuming, especially if I'm just kind of trying to sketch ideas and work quickly to basically create a basic form that I can then work from. So in Photoshop, I'm just gonna do some sleuthing around, so to speak, right? And one of the things that you might want to do is straighten this image out first, but I'm not even gonna do that. I'm gonna be a little lazy, I'm gonna admit. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use these windows, and I'm gonna use these windows as a reference point in terms of how high things are. So let me work in here and get, there we go. That's the height of one window. I was going to Control J, and I'm going to turn that window to black and white. And so I'm just, basically what I did is I copied that window layer, okay? And what I want to do is figure out how many window layers high, okay, this building is. Now again, this building is a bit distorted. It ain't going to be perfect. But I think for this intent and purposes of this demo, it'll probably be good enough. So we know by just counting how many floors we have here. Not including the ground floor, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, 5 windows high. And then I have the ground floor, which is approximately, I'm just going to approximate here. It's roughly 2 windows high. So altogether I have about 7 windows high. Again, it's a little distorted, but close enough for this. Plus, we'll add another 1 for the top there. So we'll say in total, it's roughly 8 bay windows high. All right, good enough for me. Okay. So the first thing to do is let's just make a bay window. All right. So let's look at this object. It's basically a cube, but the sides here are kind of on an angle. So I'm going to get a primitive cube. So I've got a primitive cube here, right? And I'm going to want to create that shape that we found in the bay window. So by selecting this face, it's already selected. I can use the scaling tool, and I can scale that face in, okay? Now, the window is probably a lot deeper than our reference here, right? So what I'm going to need to do is take the back face of this cube and just move it forward. Okay, now we got a little bit more of a bay window going on here. Now I've got another angle of this building here. And from here we can see that those side windows in the bay are actually quite narrow, right? And if I was to guess, I would think you could fit about 3 of these guys into one of those guys. So 3 of these little skinny side windows would basically fit into one of these larger front-facing windows. So I'm just going to use that as a guide to figure out how far I need to move this face in, okay? Now scale-wise, I'm going to maybe scale that a little bit, as it doesn't look like the angle in my reference is all that sharp. Now again, we're not trying to make an exact copy. We're trying to make a rough version of that we can use as a base point for our own building, and we're going to cartoonify it. We're going to stylize it. So it's not going to be a photorealistic building, but it's going to be a cartoony version of that building. So there we go, 1 bay window, super technical, super complex. All we used was get primitive cube. We selected some faces. We used a scaling tool, right? Do first bay window. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to move this window back over top of what we call the origin of the world. And you'll notice on this grid, and you can turn these grids on and off in your display. So along every window view in Maya, you've got all these little icons here. I'm not going to explain them all, you're going to forget. But this here is our grid. I can toggle it on and off. Incidentally, if I hit spacebar when I'm in my view window, it's going to default me to an ortho view. Actually, let's hit this little thing on the left-hand side. See how they've got 4 cubes here? This is the best, in my opinion, kind of layout for any 3D artist, right? You're seeing things in 3 orthographic views, okay, as well as a perspective window. This window here is your top view. This window here is your front view. And this window here is your side or right side view. If you've ever done any drafting or mechanical drawings, top, front, side is basically the standard 3 images that you're going to see in any sort of a drafting or sort of technical document to show how you might fabricate an object. It's usually the best 3 views to work from. And traditionally, that's how a designer would draw something on paper and pass it off to a machinist or a carpenter to build these objects in 3 dimensions. Now with the advent of 3D modeling, we can model stuff in 3 dimensions and design things in 3 dimensions. We don't have to only work in 2D. So for a 3D artist, when I'm working in 3D, I'd like to have these 4 views up. But for the most part, I'm working in the perspective window. So if you're, if you like things like Minecraft and you like building in 3D space, you'll be very comfortable with this setup. All right, so we got this bay window. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move this bay window to my origin. And you'll notice in all these views that I have my grid on, you'll notice a darker line that creates a T in each of those views. Where those lines intersect is the origin of my world. And when I get new objects, they usually appear in the middle of the world. When you're building things, it's good to build about the origin, especially if you're going to be dealing with really big objects. It just makes your life a lot easier. Okay, so I'm going to put that bay window back to the origin of the world. You'll notice my pivot point, because I've moved those faces around, is outside of the object. And what I want to do is return that pivot point to where it should be. So what I'm going to actually do here is I'm going to go hit modify, and in modify there's a bunch of these different tool sets. I'm going to basically center my pivot point, and you'll notice that this icon is going to jump to the center of the object. Boom. Now I can change that pivot point by hitting the insert key on my keyboard and just moving that pivot point to anywhere I want. So if I wanted to put the pivot point back on the ground plane, so to speak, I can do that by just eyeballing this and moving it back down to there. I'm going to leave it in the center of my object for now. So if you do want to move your pivot point, it's insert, insert, and then you can move that pivot point to wherever you want on an object. I'm just going to leave it at the center. And then after you're done with it, hit insert again, and you're back to normal. Okay, there we go. We got a bay window, super simplified. Okay, and we said it was going to be 8 bay windows high. So I'm going to show you the next favorite tool, which is the duplicate tool. I'm going to go back to my perspective window. Okay, so to duplicate something, all I need to do is hold Control down and D, and you've noticed that something funny happened there. I've got 2 objects now. But what I want to do is I want to count 8 bay windows high. Right, so actually before we do that, let's double check our reference and let's look at this. And this window is much more rectilinear than square, and it's quite tall compared to its width, right? And if I had to guess, I would say it's about 1.7 in the height and 1 across for the width. So let's see, I think we're a little short. So what I'm going to do, it's going to go to our front view. I'm going to grab vertices, and I'm just going to pull those up a little bit. That looks a little bit better. Maybe I pulled that up too much. So I'm going to pull it back down. There. Again, we're just eyeballing this. Okay, that looks better. Now I'm ready to do some duplicating. So I need 8 tall. Control D, move this up. Control D, move it up. So I can keep doing this until I have this thing 8 tall, and then I know that's the average height of the building. I got a better way of doing it. I'm actually going to also turn on, in my shading mode, I'm going to turn what's called wireframe on shading. And that's just going to let me see the wireframe, the wires, the edges of that object, even when it's not selected, which I find is really helpful. Okay, select the object, but rather than Control D, I'm going to Shift D. And then I'm going to move this into place. That's pretty good. And then I'm going to hit Shift D again. And what Shift D does is a special duplicate. It just remembers the transforms you put on that object. So it's going to keep displacing that object the same distance that I did the first time. So how many do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. All right. So how many we had? I forgot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right. 8 tall. So that's roughly how tall our building is going to be. Let's get another cube. And let's scale that up. And I'm going to just back it off so the windows actually are in front of it. And let's scale first in Y. So our building needs to be about that height there. and then we're going to scale with an X. So I'm going to need at least 2 rows of the bay windows if we go back and look at the reference, right? And then in terms of the depth of this building, it's quite long, very long and narrow. And if you look at this carefully from top view, it cuts back, then goes back along, then cuts back out again. We're just gonna make it long. We're not gonna worry about that detail. And a lot of buildings in the city are what I would call infill buildings, in that the lots in the city, especially in the urban center, land is so expensive. So you're not going to have like a big open space around. You're going to have building, and then your neighbor's going to be butt up right next beside you, and his neighbor's going to butt up right next beside him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we call those infill buildings. We're filling in different lots in a city block, and we're building right to the property line, and maximizing our land space as best as possible. All right. We have all these cubes. All right, so the other thing I'm going to show you guys is something called parenting. So I've selected all of these objects, and the last one I selected is highlighted in green. If I hit P on the keyboard, and watch what happens over here in what we call our outliner. Our outliner is just basically all of these objects expressed almost like a text file. If I hit P, all of these are going to collapse into one. And that one is that bottom one that was the last one selected, green. That one is now, if I open this up, that one here, cube 1, which is that one, cube 1, is now the parent of all these other little cubes, right? And when we were small, we used to hold our mom and dad's hand, right? No different with the parent. The parent, wherever the parent goes, the children go, right? Now the children, if I just grab a child, they can run freely, okay? But if the parent moves, that child is going with them. So this is a really good way to organize objects in your scene, right? I obviously want to use this to gauge the height of my building, right? I've got this basic cube, which is my building itself, and these cubes, these bays represent the bay windows. I can now also, I'm going to go into the front view to do this, expand that. Excuse me. We need 2 bay windows according to our reference, right? 2 bay windows. These are all parented together. I can also rename this. I can call this bay window. Notice that in my naming here, in my outliner, I use an underscore. Maya really likes underscores, really hates spaces, right? So I would not avoid using spaces in your name. Okay, I have this row of bay windows that are proxied. I'm going to Control D, and I'm going to move them over here. Now, I had mentioned earlier, it's good to build things about the origin of the world, and this is one example of that. This building is going to have these bay windows pretty much on equal sides of the center line of that building. I'm just eyeballing it here. So I know this stack of bay windows is, if I look at its translation in what we call the channel box, okay, its translation is negative 10.197 units. So just let's go with negative 10, nice round number. This one, by definition, if this black dark line is the 0 point of my X, should be in positive 10. So that those 2 objects are equally spaced about the center of the universe, which is the center of my building. All right, so now we got some basic rough modeling done. These bottom 2 cubes here, we don't really need because they are not part of the building. If we look at it, we just use them to measure the height of that bottom floor. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually, I'm going to disconnect my children. So they've grown up. I'm going to kick them out of the house. I'm going to hit Shift and P, and you'll notice that they jumped outside of the parent there. I'm going to do the same for this one. The reason why I'm doing that is I'm basically going to delete those bottom 2 buildings, and one of them is the parent, so I need them to not have that relationship. All right, look at that. We got our ground retail floor, we got our apartments, and then those two on the top weren't there either. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, look at that. Woohoo! Look at our building. It's so incredibly boring. Okay, let's divide this this big mass, this cube, up into sections. And what I'm going to do is add in something called an edge loop. An edge loop is more edges. And it's called an edge loop because the edge goes all the way or loops around the whole object, depending on which direction I choose it to go in. So by selecting the object, I'm going to go into Mesh Tools. And inside of Mesh Tools, there's this thing called Insert Edge Loop. I click on that, and then you'll see my box went blue. If I click, you'll see this dotted green line showing up. If I'm holding my left mouse button down, I can move that dotted green line, that edge loop, anywhere onto this object. And when I let go of the left mouse button, it will place that edge loop where I let go. So I'm going to try and put one at the bottom. Okay, and that's the bottom retail component of the building. And then I'm also going to put, let's see, I'm going to put one up here at the top where all these windows end. All right. And just to help me organize this building into floors, I'm also going to add one of these for each floor. Now, I'm going to do this one in my front view plane. But before I do that, I'm going to hit Shaded, Wireframe on Shaded, and then I can see where those intersections are. It's going to be a little bit more accurate. Now, you can also add edge loops evenly across an object. Each their own. Like I said, we're not modeling this for production. We're modeling this as designers. Okay, so I have each of the floors represented in that edge loop. Whenever I use Insert Edge Loop, after I'm done with that tool, I'll hit the Q button on the keyboard, and that will quit out of the tool. You'll find sometimes if you don't quit out of the tool and you go do something else, you'll add edge loops where you didn't mean to. So there we go. We're on our way to a building. Okay, so let's put in this cornice detail up in here. So when you're doing architecture, there's a zillion and one different phrases for the different parts of a building. And I'll be honest with you, I can never remember them all. But the internet is a beautiful thing. So if you look up on the internet, different kind of names for different building parts, they'll come up, right? And it's kind of good to know some basics in a building. Like these are columns. These fancy bits on top of a column are the capital. This this triangular shape here with the fancy carvings on it, it's a triangular pediment. The entablature is this kind of bit where you've got between the columns and the roof or the pediments, you've got this fancy bit of decoration in here, very typical of Greek and Roman architecture. You've got fluting on columns. I mean, the list is endless, as you can see from this image. And then houses themselves have different kind of architectural terms too. A roof, a gable, a dormer, right? Window mullions. Look at this. What is this here? There's 114 different names of things on here. I think some of this kind of vocabulary is good for you to understand as a designer when you're talking to other designers in terms of what you're trying to detail or design, right? So getting yourself familiar with some of these words is great. So we're going to build the cornice detail up on top here of this building, which is this kind of really funky classical type element. Oops, sorry. And if I can just scroll down in my thing here, we can see all the detail, but we're not going to build all of this detail in this proxy model. But what we want to get is the basic height of this thing and how it's broken up into what I would say 3 sections. First section being the first detail, this big shape. The second section being this middle component, which has all these little intricate carvings. I think these are called dentils. And then the bottom part, which is more of these kind of cube-like pieces. All right, let's go build that. Let's go back to Maya. Okay, so where do you think we should start? Well, simplest is always get primitive cube. And then I'm just going to scale that sucker up. I know from my referencing Photoshop, it's flush with the sides of the building. So from a width point of view, it's going to be the same width as my building. Because I've modeled everything about the center of my universe, right, around that origin, if I scale stuff uniformly, it should end up being in the center. Just going to translate that to the top here, right? And we know that's way too big, so I'm going to scale it down. And it's way too thick, so I'm going to scale it in Z and just kind of get a rough representation of that in my model. It's just a cube right now. I haven't figured out all that stuff, but I just want to block it in as a proxy. I've got something similar on the bottom where those bay windows end, and then I have this kind of modern storefront. My guess is this building at one time looked very different than it does now. But the street level part, the commercial aspect of this building has been revamped. The facade has definitely been changed and modernized, for better or worse. It's now print. And then you still have these apartment buildings above it. I'm guessing that this door goes into print, and this door over here probably goes into the apartment building. So this building has been retrofitted from its original use. I've got another view of it we can see there. So my guess is there were more kind of decorative bits of architecture under here. But we're going to build it the way we see it here, because this is very indicative of what historical buildings go through in the city. So we need another row of architectural detail on the bottom here. I don't think it's quite as tall as that one, but I'm going to use that to block it in, right? The other thing too to remember is in a program like Maya or any digital program, it's okay to make mistakes. What's great about digital technology, it really allows us to go back and augment and edit things after the fact, right? So if you don't get it perfect the first time, don't sweat it, man. What's great about this is we can go back and change things quite easily. Okay, we haven't been working a lot, but we have been working. We got some basics going on here. Let's save this file, right? So one of the things you might want to do is set a project, right? And we don't have a project to set. So actually, let's bring up our project window, and we're going to make a new project. So one of the first things you got to do is you got to give this project a location. So I'm going to click on new, and that will allow me to make a new project. The name of this is I'm going to call this Hastings Building, and I'm going to use an underscore. Remember, Maya does not like spaces in names. So even though modern day operating systems will allow us to put spaces, Maya don't like it. Super old school. So you're going to want to use that underscore. And I'm going to find a spot for this. So I'm going to go and browse to a spot on my computer or my network that's appropriate to put in this project. And where should I put this? I'm going to put this on my computer. No, I don't want to put it in my computer. I'm going to put it on what's called my H drive. So for those of you working at BFS, you know what an H drive is. And I'm going to go into my shared folder. And I'm going to put this, I'm going to make let's see here. I'm going to make a new folder. And I'm going to call this 3D underscore buildings. And I'm going to select that folder. And that is where my Hastings Building project folder is going to live. And in Maya, when I set a project up, okay, it's actually going to create a folder called Hastings Building. And inside Hastings Building, it's going to create all these subfolders. These folders are going to hold a lot of different information. The primary one is my scene folder, which will hold this file. It's called a scene file. But it's also going to hold images, source images, render data, clips, sound, etc. that would be associated with this building and this project. So I'm going to hit accept. It's going to make that project window, that project folder for me. And let's see now, if I save, by default, it's going into that folder. Okay, and by default, it chooses my scene subfolder because that's where it keeps scenes. Makes that sense. Now I'm going to name this file. I'm going to call it Hastings Building. And one of the things that I'm very used to being a production artist is knowing that there's going to be 4 billion different versions of this building before my director approves it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a _001 being version 1. The next version I might save out might be version 002, etc., etc. I can work up to 1,000, well, actually 999 versions before I run out. So I'm pretty sure I'm going to get it approved before then. So let's do a save as. All right, now that file's saved. This blows up, no problem. We just load it back up again. All right, let's keep going. So we got basic block out of that building. All right, what else should we do? Let's add these little kind of slanty roof things here on top of my bay window. Right, so I'm just going to go get another primitive cube. I'm going to scale it up. I'm going to translate it. Right, and I'm going to go into my front view. I'm going to try to put it right in the middle of that sucker. I'm going to scale it a little bit more. Let's see, what does that look like? So it looks like it is more or less the width of this bay window, maybe a little bit wider. So I'm going to scale just a tiny bit. And then we're going to move this on top there, but it's too tall from the looks of it. So there's a little bit of space between that and this cornice detail. So let's go back into our perspective window. So this guy is probably a little bigger than it needs to be. Okay, so I am going to, and this is going to overhang. Going back to my reference here, checking my reference. You can see here it overhangs that bay window slightly. Yeah, that's not bad. Now I'm going to take this edge and I'm going to select this edge and I'm going to move it back until it hits that wall. Boom. Now I can hit 4 on my keyboard and it'll go to what's called wireframe. So it's not showing the surfaces and I can kind of see through these objects, and you can tell that I just shoved this geometry right in here. Now as a production modeler that might not be acceptable. As a designer, totally, it's all good. I think it's a little tall in its slope compared to my reference here. So I'm going to scale it down in Y a little bit until it feels about right. That looks pretty good. And then I can readjust this to where it feels about the right spot. That feels a little bit better. It's pretty good. All right. Let's Control D that sucker. All right, and we want to move it to the middle of that. So I know if this one is in a position of negative, it should just be -10. We moved that 10 last time, didn't we? Actually, let's make that one positive. And that was the duplicate. And let's make this land right on -10. All right. Pretty cool. All right. Now, this is just proxy. Let's proxy out the bottom part too. So what do we got on the bottom? Oops. There we go. Okay, it looks like this is divided. There's a little wall here, and there's a door here, and a door here, and windows. And that wall, roughly speaking, let's look at the front view. This one's a little bit more flat on. Roughly speaking, it's somewhere where that bay window is. Okay. Let's go back to Maya. Roughly speaking. And if we go back to this, we can tell that this is inset from the building a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to grab, let's see. So that's the face we're going to work with. I just hit F there again to frame up that face that I had selected. And then we have that, and then we have a sign too. Okay, so let's do this. We're going to add in these little details that we can see underneath the blue paint. And these look like pilasters. And And they look to be about the width of that space between where the the bay window ends and to the edge of the building, roughly. So in other words, they're about that width there. So I'm going to actually add in more edge loops. And I'm going to add an edge loop so that one's roughly there and one's roughly there. Hit my Q. And I'm going to add another edge loop because I know there's also insert edge loop. I'm going to add another one. We're going to have the sign, and then that part of the building is going to go in. Let's put that detail in there right now. I'm going to grab this face, and I'm going to show you a new tool. It's called Extrude. And what the Extrude tool is going to do is going to allow me to extrude this face that I've just selected. So to get the Extrude tool, I can hold down Control E, and then you'll see that this little box comes up. I can do a bunch of things with this face that I've extruded, right? And the simplest thing is translate it locally in Z. So I can, whoops, that's weird. What happened there? Oh, look at that. I took two faces by accident. Let's undo. Let's try this again. Okay, I've selected that face only. Control E. And if I translate it locally in Z, I can translate it out to pop it out, or I can translate it back to set it inset from the street, which if we look at our reference is exactly what it's doing. Okay, so I'm going to eyeball this. Again, doesn't have to be exact. All right, so now we got that little alcove, right, that little bit of storefront is going to go into, right? We got these two little sections for the pilasters. All right, that's pretty good. Let's add in our basic sign as well. So I'm going to get primitive cube again, and I'm going to scale that sucker up. And we'll see in the reference, it's pretty much, I'm going to make it a little bit wider. Oh no, it's right to the edge of those pilasters, so I'm going to make it about there. That's pretty good. And then it's not very thick at all. It's a typical storefront sign. These things are little boxes that have fluorescent lights on the inside. And then the signs are just plastic that's a little bit semi-transparent or translucent. And then at night, the lights go on and illuminate those signs. So the box is just a metal box that houses it all. Okay, not bad. We have our basic building shape. So let's save that. Control S, and that will allow us to save, or you can also go File, Save Scene. Let's parent all this stuff together, and let's do some naming. Because naming stuff is good in my, whoops, sorry, that's not what I wanted. Object mode. Okay, so this cube in my outliner window here is selected. I'm just gonna double click on it and call it bay window, bay underscore window. And I probably should have named this before I duplicated these all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that, go to the next one, paste, and let's see if it's smart enough to give me a 1. Enter, it gives me the 1, perfect. And paste, enter, and it's going to number them for me. Paste, enter, paste, enter. Nope, that's not the one I want. Nope, it's going to be these ones up here. Oh, there we go. Paste, enter, paste, enter, paste, enter, paste, enter, paste, enter. All right, those are my windows. Now I'm going to grab these, let's call this, what do we call this? Bay window. I'm going to call this roof. I know it's not called a roof, but I'm just going to call it roof. And I'm going to take this name again, copy it, select its partner, paste that name. There we go. So I want all this stuff here to be one object, one grouped as one group. So I'm going to hit P. There, it's all parented together. I'm going to do the same for this object. It's going to help me organize all these objects into a hierarchy. All right, so I got that, and I got that. My cornice detail, I'm just going to call it cornice for now. And then I've got my overhang detail. I was going to call this cornice. It's going to, it's technically not a cornice, I don't think. But I'm going to call it cornice. What the hell? And then store sign. And then the building itself. I think that's everything labeled. Now I'm going to parent it all together. I'm going to grab everything and I'm going to parent all to the building. The reason why I'm doing that is if I want to select this thing and move it, if I've got a ton of buildings on the street, the biggest, most easiest thing to select is the building itself. So that's why that is the parent. And it also makes sense in terms of hierarchy. It's the biggest object. The children are the little objects that are attached to the parent. We're all good. All right, let's save that. Okay, so that's the first part. Now we're going to make some more detail, right? And if we look at this building, the big cube, doesn't have a lot of detail. It's just a cube, man. It's made up of bricks, right? All the details in the bay windows and in this cornice and in this detail along here. So let's start with the bay window. We're gonna build one of these bays, right? And have some fun with it. Okay, Photoshop, you can stop that now. Now the cool thing about the proxy is I can actually use the proxy and iterate on shape, and proportion, right? Let's actually do that before we move on to the bay window detail. So I'm just going to Control D, and I'm going to give myself multiple different versions of this building. This is what I love about 3D, right? You can really quickly make lots of variations of the same object. And my experience in production is a lot of times that's what they want you to do because they're trying to figure out what something should look like. Trust me, the director doesn't always know. They have an idea. Our job is to help them figure out what that is by showing them lots of different versions of kind of something of what they want, and then they kind of pick and choose and eliminate things. So we want to create sort of a stylized, cartoony version of this Hastings building. So one of the things I'm going to try and do is take it off of rectilinear. In the real world, things are, when we build buildings, we want them to be 90 degrees. We want them to be square. We want them to kind of fit into this perfect shape. In the cartooning world, we're going to exaggerate shapes. We're going to make, animators like to use the word wonky, right? We're going to make it kind of wonky. So what I'm going to do is just play around by manipulating some of these vertices. So I'm going to work in front view, and I'm just going to deal with the front view of this building. So I can do that, but that's wrong. I can move these. Let's pick. We just want to pick. Let's use a lattice. Maybe a lattice might be better. So I'm going to go into my animation tools, and inside of the form is this thing called a lattice. With my building selected, I'm going to pick on lattice, and a lattice, you can see it here, is basically a cage around that building, okay, that has some basic vertices. Let's just delete this one for now so we can see this better. And it has vertices, and I can select those lattice points, okay, and I can manipulate those lattice points. And these lattice points will manipulate all the geometry underneath, right? Look at that. So I want to actually pick those 2 rows because I want to give my building a slight tilt one way, right? And then I'm going to pick these lattice points and do the same, but maybe less extreme. Very, very subtle. And I can pick these lattice points. Actually, let's pick them one at a time. So you can see that building now is a little bit distorted from reality. Let's just turn off the lattice. So in show, in any window, you can show none and you can't see anything. You can show all and see all of the different things. I'm going to turn off lattice. So I'm just going to find lattice in this list. And I'm going to turn it off. Controllers, lights. Oh my God, where are you, lattice? Maybe it's under manipulators. Nope. Oh, this is embarrassing. Where the heck are you? Controllers? Maybe it's a controller? There. Image planes, IP handles, particle instances, fluids. Huh. All right. I should be able to turn that off. Maybe I can't turn it off. Play blast display. Well, that's cool. I didn't know that existed. Okay, never mind. Damn, there must be a way to turn that off. I'll figure it out and I'll get back to you guys. We can kind of lattice that building and make it kind of cartoony, which is kind of cool, right? And we can do different versions of that as well. So let's do one more before we go on to detail. Control D, take that building, go into my animation tool, under deform, I can create a lattice. And if you click on the cube in here, and any of these tools for that matter, you can bring up all the parameters of the tool. So by default, this is going to give me 2 divisions in X, 5 divisions in Y, and 2 divisions in Z. Let's hit create. All right. What do we do with this one? Let's, oops. Let's run this lattice. Oops. Run the lattice. No, I don't want vertexes. I want lattice. Very strange. Very strange. Okay, lattice points. Let's make this building a little bit wider. And let's also make this building more squat. So this might be something that you would show a director in early preliminary designs, just to figure out a shape language in terms of what we want those buildings to look like. All right, so that is actually probably more than enough that you could then take this into something like a drawing program and add detail to. But before we do that, we're going to learn how to do a little bit more modeling detail and explore some more modeling tools. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to grab these 3 buildings. And in this, on the right side view, I've got this thing called layers. I'm going to click on layers. I'm going to say create layer from selected. And now what I can do is I can toggle that layer on and off. Okay. I'll select these lattices and see if I can add them. It won't allow me to add those into my layer. Okay, well, I'm going to hide them. And I can select them and hit H, and it'll hide my lattices. So there we go, there we go. Now we know how to, we just need to hide the lattices. There we got 3 different cartooning versions of that first building that we built from reference. Very basic proxy modeling that we can even then take into a drawing program and draw on top of it. But I think instead we're going to keep motoring on, and we're going to look at how to build some detail. But maybe I'll just sum it up there for this video, and I'll do another video for building the bay window and using more of the Extrude tool to help us build a little bit more detail into this basic shape. So hopefully you were able to follow along this little tutorial and figure out some basic tools. I'm going to do a recap really quick before we wrap up. So we have cubes, right? And the cubes can be manipulated with our SRTs, our translation, rotation, and scaling. And those are the W, E, R buttons on your keyboard. So when you have something selected, hit W, it'll give you translation. Hit E, it'll give you rotation. Hit R, it'll give you scaling. All objects are made up of different components. Edges are good to use. You can select edges and you can move them around, manipulate that object. You can also select vertices or vertexes, and they're the little red dots that you see on all of the objects, and you can do multi-selects, right, and translate certain points together. And then you've got faces that you can select on, and you can move those faces around. You can rotate them. And then the last thing you can do, and we'll get more into it in the next lesson, is you can extrude these faces, Control E, right, and you can extrude those faces. And that's a fun thing to do as well, to create some pretty crazy objects. Look at that. That looks like a Daniel Libeskind building. Art Gallery of Toronto. There you go. That's how he made it. Simple modeling tools. To navigate, use your Alt button and your left mouse button to orbit around an object, right mouse button to dolly in, dolly out, and middle mouse button to dolly left, right. You can also use your scroll wheel if you have a mouse with a scroll wheel, and you can zoom in and out of your viewport. Hit the space bar and you go from one view into default 4 views. If the space bar thing doesn't work, you can also click on these little icons to the left here. Here you have a top view, a front view, and a side view. And they're also labeled here too. Top being Y, front being Z, side being X, right? And then on the top right-hand corner, you have your perspective window or your camera window. We're not going to talk too much about camera right now, but that would be something for a future lesson. So there you have it, right? Some basic orientation in Maya, your translation, rotation, and scaling, or SRT as they're known. Those are your basic tools to move things around and how to navigate with your camera. As you'll notice, there are a zillion and one other buttons up in here. We're not going to get too concerned with that. The other thing you need to remember is this outliner window over here, which has all of our objects in our scene. And then the other thing to remember is saving your scene. Save often, go to your project window, create a project like we did earlier, right? And make sure you save your scenes. So that's the lesson for today. We will get back to some more interesting detailed modeling in the next lesson. But for now, I think we're just going to leave it at that. There are buildings. Don't look so exciting from the top view, but from the front and from the, well, mostly from the front. There you go. Thanks for watching, everybody. Good luck. Model fast, model fun. Don't be afraid. You're not going to break anything. And we'll see you next time. Ciao.